Speaker.
The question is that the amendment be agreed to. I call the Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm surprised at the contribution from the last speaker because it really doesn't ring true, given that most New Zealanders are rightly worried about whether their jobs are going to be there next week, whether they're going to be able to meet the rising cost of living. And then when I heard Amy Adams say that she inherited an economy, or her government inherited an economy that was a cot case, I thought that I really did have to put the record straight, because there is no doubt that the last Labor government, the fifth Labor government, was fiscally responsible, and we did run budget surpluses for 8 years in succession, each one of which was opposed by National. And it was National who opposed budget surpluses and called for tax cuts that would have further fuelled the asset bubbles and further fuelled the debt and inflation pressures that New Zealand had, along with the rest of the Western world at that time. So to hear National trying to rewrite that history and say that we were fiscally irresponsible is just not correct. In stark contrast, the National government has now got us to a position where this year we've got a $16.7 billion deficit. So rather than running surpluses, we're running a very large deficit. And why? Because the economy is stagnant and not growing. Mr. Speaker, I think the thing that disturbs me most about the budget and the supplementary estimates is that every time the government comes back to this House and asks for more money to spend, they have to open up and say, well, we're not collecting as much revenue as we thought we would, because the economy's not going as well as they had previously predicted. And secondly, they're having to spend more money than they were previously predicting, and so every time they come back and the deficit grows. Mr. Speaker, I think that after 2.5 years of this current government, it's fair for the people of New Zealand to ask whether the government is succeeding. And when we ask whether they're succeeding, we have to ask, what measure should we use? Well, I think we should be generous. I think we should use the measures that they were elected upon, the promises that they made. Well, Moana Maki asks, what were they? Well, the first one, of course, was that they were going to close the wage gap with Australia. And, of course, they haven't. They haven't. Despite record commodity prices in our major trading partners, Australia and China, the income levels between New Zealand and Australia have widened. That gap has grown. Their second promise was that they were going to cause a step change in the economy. Well, that hasn't happened. That phrase has even dropped out of their language. Mr. Speaker, the more concerning thing for me is the underlying trend. In the documents that the Minister of Finance is required to produce as part of the budget, two statistics which really worry me. The first is our current account deficit. Now, the current account deficit does blip into positive figures for this year, in large part, or in substantial part, because we get the reinsurance proceeds from the Canterbury earthquake coming into New Zealand, and therefore that's new money into the economy, which together with the money we get from our exports overseas means that for this 1 year we have a current account surplus, a very small one. From every year here on till the end of the projection period, New Zealand's current account deficit gets worse as we spend more as a country than we earn. Every year New Zealand's current account deficit grows, so that by the end of the forecast period it's back to 6.9% of GDP, a very substantial current account deficit. And that flows through to New Zealand's net asset position in the world, or more correctly in our case, our net debt position in the world, because New Zealand increasingly owes more and more money overseas. And I'm not just talking about the gross debt, the total amount of debt, I'm talking about the total indebtedness that New Zealand has to the rest of the world, what the rest of the world owns in New Zealand, less what we own overseas. And that's the measure that the Honourable Bill English used repeatedly in this House earlier in the year as being what he said was the major indicator of New Zealand's failing economy, that our net indebtedness position in the world was getting worse. And then what does this budget show? It shows that every year hereafter it gets worse still. So that by the end of the projection period, if National was to be re-elected, then, and they had been in government for 6 years, New Zealand's net indebtedness, net international debt position gets worse, and it rises from minus 78.6% of GDP this year to minus 85.3% of GDP by 2015. By that time, and this is all predicated on the National government being re-elected at the end of the year, which we of course don't accept. But if they have their way and they are re-elected, they're effectively saying that this great aspirational government for New Zealand gets us poorer every year. What Bill English does when he goes home in the evening is he says, "Honey, I shrank the economy." That's his key line. "Honey, I shrank the economy," or "Honey, I grew the debt." I grew the debt, because New Zealand's net international position gets worse every year from here on, according to the budget projections. Now, Mr. Speaker, the difference between what the government is proposing and what the opposition Labour Party proposes is that we really do think there is a need for material structural change in the economy. Material structural change in the economy is necessary if we're going to avoid this trend that the current government has for us of getting poorer as a country. Now, the economic settings of the country are largely unchanged in the last couple of decades. There's been a little bit of a tweak by the government in terms of its income tax policy, which was, in our view, disproportionately favouring of those who are already best off, the top 10% of income earners garnering 42% of the income tax cuts. But the basic shape of the economy is not going to change, as evidenced by the fact that our current account deficit goes up and our net debt goes up as well. And the only way we're going to change that is if we change the breadth of our exports. We can't catch up with the rest of the world and do better just by selling more primary produce. Now, primary produce will continue to be important, and Labour will support those traditional export industries. But where we differ from the government is that we actually don't think that continued success in primary produce, plus some more what are generally low-valued jobs in tourism, will be enough to make the difference that we need to have made in New Zealand, so that once again we start getting wealthier as a country rather than poorer. Mr. English, in his contribution a few minutes ago, said that we needed to get over borrowing for consumption, and yet actually that's what this budget shows. We've got a return to a current account deficit, more borrowing, much of which will be consumed, leading to higher levels of debt long term. The only way out of that is to have broader exports, not just more exports from the pastoral sector. The Honourable David Carter came to the Commerce Select Committee on the estimates and said in respect of questioning as to why they were favouring subsidies for new irrigation schemes in the agricultural sector over support for other sectors of the export economy, after denying for a start that it was a subsidy, he in the end turned around and attacked me, who was asking the questions, and said, well, the Labour Party might not support the agricultural sector, but National does. It's the only game in town. Those were his words. It's the only game in town. And it's that narrow vision from the National Party which has New Zealand destined to continue down this route of getting poorer every year. We must broaden our exports. To do that, we need to favour our export sector with policy. We need changes to monetary policy. We need improvements to savings rather than undermining KiwiSaver. We need changes to our tax system to make it fairer to exporters and less advantageous to the speculative sector. And we need a range of microeconomic changes, including things like a research and development tax credit, the likes of which the Labour Party has recently announced. We need a lot of additional sectoral-based initiatives in new areas of our economy that can produce export jobs. Without it, the trend will continue: rising debt, more people moving to Australia. We're fast becoming a training ground for people who don't have a good job in which to utilise those skills, and so they move to Australia, so much so that Julia Gillard on a recent visit said that Australia views New Zealand as a good country for the source of well-trained immigrants into their country who build their economy stronger at a loss to ours. That's no more evident at the moment than it is in respect of the building trades, where despite the need for skilled trades to rebuild Christchurch and build in Auckland, we're losing them to Australia too.